Harley, once again, it's Friday morning, 10:30 a.m. Eastern. Harley is in the building. How's it going, Harley?
It's going fine. Good to
Awesome.
talk with you.
Good to talk to you too. This is Frank filling in for V. V's back from vacation Monday. He's eating bananas on a beach somewhere. So, but we're here and you're here. So thanks for joining us. So, what's your top topic on your mind? I know the G7 is coming up. You find some irony in it. What's going on with that?
The G7, it seems to be an anachronism now. Macron said there won't be a communique because he doesn't expect people to agree on anything.
Wow.
Well, why have the meeting? But if you look at it, there's the irony is that with all that we hear in the United States about how Trump is facing recession, Trump's a racist, Trump's going to lose the election, and on and on and on. Trump made a comment which is absolutely true. He's coming into the G7 meeting as the strongest leader of the G7 countries. You have the Canadian president is facing scandals in an election, Trudeau, or prime minister. The German government is very weak, recession talk, miracles on her way out. You have Hong Kong having an effect on the Chinese situation. You have Brexit. You have the Japanese in a pretty bad dust up with the South Koreans. And then you have the collapse of the Italian government. So Trump is right. He's coming in with the strongest head of wind. And the only thing maybe that Trump and Macron agree on is that it's time to bring Russia back in and turn it into the G8. Now, that would certainly make things more interesting because you'd at least have one stable nation that would be involved in the mix. So I think what they're not going to talk about is the collapse of the European Union, the effect that Brexit would have, whether it's a hard Brexit or not.
So you think that they're going to avoid everything of importance?
Well, I don't think they can talk about anything because none of them have any clues as to what to do.
Yeah.
They have opinions. What's Boris Johnson going to do? Say, please give us what we want? What's Merkel going to say? Stop attacking the auto industry? I mean, Merkel's the one who's attacking her own industries.
Yeah.
So I think it's one of these moments where you see the complete disarray in the West, which is partly the result of destabilization operations being run by, in many cases, British and US intelligence and financial networks. Mm-hmm. But it's also the breakdown of the system overall.
And what's their goal with the destabilization?
Who would be running it? Or what's their goal? Is that what you asked?
Yeah. What's the goal of you said a second ago? I don't know exactly how you said it, but there these ops to destabilize. What is their ultimate goal?
Well,
what's their motive?
What they're afraid of, what the City of London and Wall Street are afraid of, is that as countries weaken, as the economy in Germany gets weaker, where's Germany going to go? They're likely going to turn toward Russia and China. What about the Italians? They've already turned toward China. They have a memo of understanding for major projects with China. Where's France going to go? I mean, Macron is just a placekeeper for the bankers, but some of them are getting very antsy because they are sitting on top of piles of uncollectible debt, derivative contracts that may become invalid if the clearinghouses in the City of London are somehow kept out of the European Union. So they don't have a solution. And the Chinese have the one solution, and it's under attack dramatically, both with the operations in Hong Kong and also from the EU. But the question then is, what's Trump going to do? Trump has no use for most of the governments in Europe. And he is looking, the fact that Trump and Macron talked about bringing Putin in gives you an indication that there is some backroom talk going on about how do you come up with a stabilizing situation. And it's not going to come from any of these countries.
Interesting. Do you think the constant, I don't know how to put it into words, but just the constant political social justice warrior hysteria that we see, and it's not just in our country, it's global, especially in the West. Do they love that so much because it's a distraction from all of this economic political chaos, or is it more? Is it grow at more of a base culture level?
Yeah. I think it's both. On the one hand, the distraction is useful to them because the only other distraction they have is war. But there's
Their
another part
favorite.
of it, which is that if you can break nations down into smaller groups, tribes, uh, family, religious groups,
Hmm.
sexual identity groups, you lose the ability to organize people around a national interest.
Yes.
And this is what the globalists want. They want no national sovereign states that would recognize that they have a higher purpose than subordinating their country to global gangsters and swindlers.
Mm. Yeah, and
So,
this is where you make any kind of national pride. You call it white supremacy.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mm.
And, in Germany, if there's any national pride, they say it's a resurgence of Nazism.
Yeah.
And now they're saying that about Trump, too, that if Trump
Yep.
says, be proud of America, well, that's white supremacy talking.
It's insane.
So
Do you think
I
you think the average? I mean, my gut is the average person sees through that and sees that it's crazy, but our media takes it very, very seriously. What do you think?
Well, from all the radio work I do in the United States, I hardly ever get a question from someone who identifies as a transgender person who's concerned with their rights.
Right.
You're talking about increasingly small segments of the population which are being given primary identities
Yeah.
in shaping national policy. And, Trump isn't saying go out and crush them. He's saying, look, you're American. Let's make America work. Let's
Yeah.
get this country going and do things that are good for everyone. And if you do that, you break away from the divide and conquer, which otherwise takes over.
Yeah. You don't see it in the adult population, but I have kids in middle school and high school, and they're making major inroads in brainwashing these kids into all kinds of dysfunction.
Of
And
course.
so I'm wondering if the next generation, the literal kids coming up now, if they're going to look at all of this and like it could go either way, or maybe somewhere in the middle where it's split, where they just look at us and go, "This is ridiculous. This is this is nonsense." Or are they going to come along and they're going to actually believe this narrative and be so screwed up that they just completely tear the country apart?
Well, I have young kids too, and I have the same worry. But I'll tell you, one of the things that's important is talking to the kids and giving them an alternative and telling them not to be afraid to stand up for what they believe in.
Yeah.
Because these kinds of fragmented identities only take over when people are silenced and told you're not being politically correct. And I think one of the things that's interesting about young people is that while you can, if you have an aggressive brainwashing teacher or a senior figure working on them, you can manipulate them into accepting these things.
Hmm.
But if you give them an opportunity to think,
There's a lot of
they're
grooming that goes
going to
on.
be
Yeah.
stampeded. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I just said there's a lot of grooming that goes on. Agreeing with what you said with the teachers and stuff like that. It's upsetting.
Well, you have groups like the National Education Association and the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, which in many cases have been on the front lines on this. This is the whole point of what Bertrand Russell, who LaRouche called the most evil man of the 20th century, what Russell said is get them while they're young and brainwash them while they're young.
Yeah.
And we see that, and it's really an important thing that for the president to stand firm on these things does give parents and those who don't like this stuff an opportunity to talk about it with their kids and also in the schools with the teachers. My daughter raised the whole question of why should she take a day off school to protest climate change when she doesn't agree that it's caused by man.
Exactly.
And the teacher pulled her aside and said, well, I agree with you, but we're told we have
Wow.
a lesson plan.
Wow. Wow. Mr. B in comments says, where I'm from, they will believe the narrative and rip the country apart. It seems possible. Also, Harley, you don't know this, but we have a famous cat lady in the audience named Jen S., a friend of mine. She's one of the original cat bloggers. Very famous person. She has a question for you. Morning, guys. Harley, what are your thoughts on the extradition protests in Hong Kong in regards to the markets? You got any quick thoughts on that?
Well, it's no longer an extradition protest. It's actually an attempt to have a regime change in Hong Kong.
Okay.
And ultimately, it's not going to work, but it could do significant damage if the Chinese feel provoked enough that they have to come in and with a crackdown. But I don't think they do. I mean, I think the biggest danger is that the financial system is so fragile that there are many potential triggers for a crash.
Hmm.
And the Hong Kong situation is probably on the middle range of one of those triggers. It's not quite up there with uh, uh, student debt or derivative debt or things of that sort. But if you have a worsening of the situation between China and the US, that is a real worry because these are the two largest economies in the world. And frankly, I think what Trump and Xi both know is that both the United States and China need each other. And to the extent that they're moving toward odds and loggerheads, you have some tremendous potential damage that can be done.
Mm, indeed. Question that came up the other day. I was wondering what your take is on it, and there's a couple other things I know you want to cover, but we had a question in one of our live shows from a guy, and this is a person who uh, working individual, minimum wage, just trying to scrape by. We talk a lot about this coming doom and recession. Just wondering a timeline for when it's going to hit people like him. And we essentially said it probably already is. But when is the average person going to sort of wake up and say, okay, we're in recession? What's your thoughts on the timeline we're looking at?
I think the average person already knows the times are tough.
Yeah,
You come to the end of your savings before the end of the month.
absolutely.
You have utility costs going up, food costs going up, housing costs are skyrocketing, medical costs are going up. If you're young and healthy and live with your parents, you're probably not noticing yet that we're in a recession.
Young
But I
being under 30.
yeah, yeah, exactly. But I think most working people, and especially with families, are well aware that even two jobs is not enough.
Right.
And I think the president uh, toying around with the idea of middle class tax cuts is an indication that someone's getting to Trump and saying, look, a lot of your supporters are hurting right now.
Big time.
Farmers are hurting. The industrial workers that we're supposed to be providing new manufacturing jobs for, they're not getting the jobs because the jobs aren't coming back. So I think a lot of people are hurting. And then the other thing, the last people to know usually are retirees until they check on their 401ks. And while many of them are somewhat comfortable right now, remember 2008. One day you were rich, and the next day you were heading out the door, maybe losing your house.
Mm. You wanted to talk a little bit more about how Brexit is basically hanging over everything, the Italian government collapse that's going on. Would you share your thoughts on those things with us?
Sure. The last couple of days, I've had a number of meetings with people to discuss the situation in Europe, with people here in Berlin. And there are two things that stand out. One is the European Union ran an operation to collapse the Italian government.
Hmm.
Now, ultimately, Salvini of the Lega, who decided since they're not going to let him do what's necessary, that he'll pull out of the government. But this was a setup, and it was done by the new head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, the former German defense minister, who went behind the backs of people to key leaders in Italy and said, we'll support you if you pull down the government. Now, the reason they were doing that is that they were trying to stop Salvini, who's becoming more and more popular because he's taking an increasingly anti-Brussels, anti-EU stance. So Salvini's a bit of a gambler. He basically said, well, we'll take the chance that they won't be able to pull together a government and we'll have new elections.
Mm-hmm.
But in the meantime, the situation in Italy is quite chaotic. Now, in terms of Brexit, I mean, Boris Johnson was in Berlin 2 days ago. He's trying. He was in, I think, meeting with Macron today before the G7. He's trying to get some kind of agreement, but he's not going to get it. The EU is basically trying to say to the rest of the other 27 nations, if you pull out of the EU, we'll punish you. Now, in the meantime, what I find most hypocritical is that there's one grouping in the United Kingdom that the EU is giving what they want, and that's the City of London. They signed an agreement in December of last year, the European Markets Committee, with the London banks, saying that they could violate EU rules after the Brexit because they don't want a disruption of the clearinghouses in the derivatives trade.
Mm.
Almost 90% of European derivatives trading goes through City of London clearinghouses, 3 clearinghouses. And if you don't have them, you don't have anyone certifying the agreements. And under the standard agreement on Brexit, they wouldn't be allowed to work with the countries or clients in the EU. So they gave them a special status. And I think that tells you that whatever else goes on, the leading globalist bankers are going to take care of themselves first.
Mm-hmm. And lastly for today, by the way, if we have time, folks, if you're in the live chat, you want to throw up some questions for Harley, we'll try to hit them. We only have a few minutes left. But very interesting story. I think you said it was in the Washington Post about the El Paso shooter.
Yeah, I think, Frank, we discussed this last week, the fact that what this guy wrote in his manifesto was, besides the anti-Mexican language, which the media tried to pin on Trump, he actually had a whole series of comments that sounded like Ocasio-Cortez and the Extinction Rebellion, the leading environmentalists. He wrote that it's increases in population that are causing the problem.
Interesting.
And there are too many people. Now, we noticed that, LaRouche PAC, we've been saying that this is the heart of the environmentalist movement, is a satanic anti-population movement.
Yeah.
But of all places, the Washington Post, I think it was on the 15th or 16th of August, had a headline story saying that what was in common between the New Zealand and El Paso shootings? Eco-fascism.
Wow.
And they identified how it is that a large number of disaffected and troubled young people have drawn the conclusion that the biggest threat to the human race is overpopulation.
Yeah.
And in both of these cases, you had very troubled people thought they could do something to solve the overpopulation problem by going out and killing a lot of people.
Wow.
So
Amazing.
the fact that this was in the Washington Post.
So not exactly Trump supporters.
Well, not only that, but they're big supporters of all the fraud of environmentalism.
Yeah.
And now they're saying, well, there is some legitimacy to showing the connection between the environmentalist movement and the old eugenics movement that was part and parcel of the Hitler genocide. So this has to have a lot of people squirming. And in a certain sense, it's the Washington Post saying that LaRouche has always been right, because since I've known LaRouche, one of his most important points was that what we're seeing in the financial world is policies of austerity to kill people off.
Wow.
Not just directly, but through tearing down public health systems and so on. You spread disease. And you can quote some of these people like Meadows and Forrester, who did the original report, or Paul Ehrlich, the idea that there are too many people, that's the problem. And now you have this poor little Asperger's syndrome girl, Greta Thunberg,
mm-hmm.
probably doesn't know what she's doing, but her parents are doing a masterful public relations job to make her an international hero.
Jeez.
What's she saying? We're all going to die in 12 years, so you might as well not go to school, not learn anything, and see if you can do something to stop eating meat, stop auto traffic, stop plane travel, and so on.
Hey, the environmentalists are getting smarter, though. They used to say 10 years, and they know that passes. So eventually they'll be saying 20 years to give themselves a little more room. They've been saying 10 years since what?
Well,
60s?
Don't forget, Prince Charles told Trump we only have 18 months to do something about
right.
it. So I guess that defines eco-radicalism.
Yeah. Well,
so
one thing to the next generation, just give them 12 years. They'll realize that we survived.
Yeah, but I think these things are important because, we've been out there fighting like hell. We're out on street corners. We're doing interviews. We're doing as much as we can, putting out pamphlets and leaflets, trying to educate people.
Yeah.
And what you find is that some of this is bouncing back in even the mainstream press. the fact that there had to be some stories about how the New York Times admitted that the whole Russia gate was a fraud, but now it's time to move on to phase two, namely Trump is a racist. You're seeing some of these things coming into public attention, and we've just got to keep fighting for more transparency, more truth, because our enemies thrive when there's darkness, when they can run diversion operations, false flags, and so on. So we've just got to make sure that we get our talking points right, and that they're not talking points; they're actually truthful statements.
Yeah. I see a lot in the comments. People have are getting a really bad stream from us. On our side, it's rock solid. We got crystal clear audio. We're not getting any hiccups. Maybe try refreshing. I mean, we're just about done anyway. We're about to wrap up. But sorry for those of you who are having trouble hearing us. We'll see what the recorded broadcast looks like. But on our end, it's rock solid. So might be YouTube or our streaming provider. Not sure. But sorry about that, folks. Hopefully everything comes out good. But yeah, no, I'm not. I'm seeing Wizardry is saying might be high CPU. I'm not having that issue right now. I have had that issue in the past when I'm hosting, but actually I'm doing really well with the new thing that we use to broadcast is solid and doesn't really rely on my computer so much. So sorry about that, folks, if it was difficult to hear. But Harley, great discussion today. Thanks so much for joining us. Where can people find you? What's the best way to find your writing and track you down?
Well, I did get some emails from people last week,
Great.
and I'll send them a link to my blog site. Just send me a request to harleysch@gmail.com. It's my personal email address, but I'd rather do it through that than the blog site, because I'm really interested in what people are thinking and
Interesting.
the questions people have, criticisms,
Mhm.
debating points, and so on. I'm very happy to have that kind of discussion.
Excellent. Excellent. And I have to bring up, I can't believe I almost forgot our partners. Let's see. Let me post the banner here. PulseWaveTrading.com. We've got a really special webinar coming up today. We're talking about Eliot Wave and how it factors into the PulseWave price trigger algorithm. So if you're interested in trading these markets, you want to join us 1 p.m. There's a link in the description to the live trading education that's coming up today. So please check that out. I'll be hosting that with my main man, Dex, the Algo Capitalist. And maybe even Mr. Kung Fu will join us. We'll have to see. But Harley, always a pleasure. Thanks so much, man. We'll be back next week, 10:30, and there will be an indomitable ape-like creature hosting the broadcast instead of
We'll be
little old me.
relaxed and rested.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. He needed more than 1 week. We'll see. But thanks again, Harley. That was great. Appreciate it. Hey, hang on while we close out here. Oh, I have a question for you.